nobody wants to say what everybody is thinking, which is this person is not fit to be the president of Harvard University. And why is that? Because they're going to get called a name. This was made all about race. Oh, you can't tolerate scholarship of this quality from a Black female? Look, we need to bring back exclusion. We're talking way too much about inclusion. Inclusion and exclusion are two halves of a normal process. Claudine Gay needed to be excluded from that office, not included.
In this video, the podcaster Chris Williamson interviews another podcaster, Eric Weinstein, who also got his PhD in mathematical physics at Harvard. They talk about a range of different issues, but I honed in on the one that has to do with DEI, specifically in regards to Claudine Gay. This is an issue that has come into the public spotlight recently after Claudine Gay earlier this year resigned from her post as the president of Harvard. So let's watch this interview where they dig deep into this issue of DEI, particularly as it relates to Harvard. But Harvard is really just a microcosm of what is going on, not just in colleges, but in schools across the nation, and also in businesses, whether they are privately owned or owned by the government. Let's watch.
You got your PhD from Harvard. How do you feel, given the most recent fallout?
These opening questions are incredible. It's amazing. It's amazing that it came to this. And as a person I know studying at Harvard said, I wonder if we are the last generation who will continue to see Harvard as this shining city on a hill. And that's, that's somebody who's there now. I think it's a disgrace, and we can't talk about it, which is the fascinating part, that we are effectively losing our society because we're afraid to say certain things, because we're being made afraid to say certain things. I don't think people understand what Harvard is and how it functions and why it's different. Harvard is really the fusion of two separate institutions. One is about brilliance and one is about power. And so you can think about this as the sharpest minds and the sharpest elbows. And the sharp mind crowd gets tons of resources because the sharp elbow crowd makes sure that power is used to perpetuate Harvard's place of privilege. And the sharp mind crowd contributes prestige to the sharp elbow crowd. And so by virtue of the fact that you can't deconflate the sharp minds and the sharp elbows, Harvard continues to have this very special place.
I want to try to expand a little bit more on what I think Eric Weinstein is saying when he juxtaposes stories and power with brilliance, because I think these words can be a bit confusing. When he says stories, I think what he's really saying are the ideologies, the political opinions that we all have, but we hopefully get to through critical thinking. I mean, most of us don't do that. Most of us don't critically think our way to ideas. We just go with whatever the population around us thinks. But for an institution that is as prestigious as Harvard to do the same thing, where instead of encouraging the rigor of communication, the clash of ideas that naturally filters out the wheat from the chaff, this is what an education system is supposed to do. An education system is not supposed to skip that process and jump straight to the narratives or the stories, as Eric Weinstein puts it. I think this is what he means when he's making this comparison between stories and brilliance. Brilliance are the great minds in such institutions who should be nourished with the power and the prestige that these institutions hold, not the other way around, where ideology, opinions, and narratives are foisted onto these minds and they're told to either accept it or get tossed to the wayside while being accused of bigotry.
Now, what is this special place? Why isn't it just a university like any other? I think sort of two or three principal reasons. One of which is that Harvard is sort of an extension of the U.S. government. The government department, which is sort of Harvard's version of poli-sci, is kind of an extension of the State Department at times. The economics department ends up setting economic policy in many ways for the United States. And above all, there is this concept that in every field, there's usually one institution that sets the narrative. So for example, in journalism, the New York Times is different than all other newspapers and news organs because of its focus on what we sometimes hear of as narrative-driven journalism. Now, people now talk a lot more about narrative, but 15 years ago, I don't think this was common knowledge, that the editorial room at the New York Times is a place where people thought about what the long arcs of stories were. And you figured out what the arc of the story was before the facts came in. So for example, Hillary is inevitable was a long arc in narrative-driven journalism. It wasn't true, but all the information that came in when Hillary was running against Donald Trump was fed through this prism of the inevitability of Hillary Clinton. In the same way, Harvard practices narrative-driven academics. It tells you what is happening, what the grand arcs are, and those, just like the 2016 election, are very often untrue. And so that's a way in which Harvard serves power. It brings people in who are brilliant, and then it takes the ones of those who are willing to play ball with the engines of power, and it enters into the storytelling mode in which Harvard sets the tone for everyone. So when you lose Harvard, it's very important and very different.
This right there is the reason why people of the likes of Jordan Peterson have heavily bemoaned the loss of such institutions to the new wave of leftist progressive ideology. By letting go of that balance that I don't know if we ever had it, but I know it's gotten worse over time. But by letting go of that balance, by letting the scales to swing so fully towards the left, what we have is a whole generation of kids growing up under the influence of what is a very insidious political ideology. For whatever difference conservatives might have made by trying to balance out this ideology somewhat, it's hard to imagine that if we do not correct course as soon as possible, the train wreck that we are witnessing is just the beginning. And this train wreck involves so many things. It's rooted in the idea of identity politics and tells us that playing victim is the best way to achieve status within our group and within the larger society. It also tells us that inclusivity is so sacrosanct as to take precedence over other qualities like competence or even fairness. And yet another thing it tries to teach us is that our subjective understanding of the world takes precedence over any objective reality that is shared amongst the collective. And to whatever extent that subjectivity comes into collision, almost inevitably, with objectivity, we need to be uncompromising in our demands for everybody else to bend towards our subjective opinions and ideas of how the world should be.
The last thing that I would say that really distinguishes Harvard is that Harvard, there's the open part of Harvard, the classrooms, and there's the closed part of Harvard that you can't see at all. And it's sort of a system of star chambers. And I don't think people who have not tangled with Harvard would comprehend how much of what Harvard gets done behind closed doors because it can't be done in the open.
Well, like, what do you mean?
I'll give you a crazy example. When I tried to get my PhD, the Harvard math department instituted a rule that said you could not attend your own thesis defense. You could not determine who would present your thesis, your dissertation. So basically what happened is, if you had an advisor, which almost everyone did, your advisor presented your thesis behind closed doors. Nobody's ever heard of this in the history of academics.
Is this how Claudine Gay got away with it?
No, I don't know. Claudine Gay was taken down for two different reasons. One reason she was taken down was for not having crisper statements about the uniformity of application of rules of codes of conduct when it came to Jewish students. So it's one thing whether you have a free speech policy, or maybe you have a code of conduct where you say we can't tolerate certain kinds of speech. Whatever that is, there's certainly a question about the differential application of that on behalf of different groups. So that was one of the ways that she got into trouble. The other way she got into trouble was the vulnerability of plagiarism and a weak academic record.
Before we move on any further, I want to give a little more context as to what Claudine Gay, the ex-president of Harvard, was accused of exactly as it pertained to plagiarism. Let's watch this interview from someone whose work was actually used by Claudine Gay and how she viewed this whole debacle with plagiarism.
With us now, author of The Adversity of Diversity, political scientist and legal scholar, Dr. Carol Swain. It's nice to see you, ma'am. Thank you. To be fair, Harvard has cleared Ms. Gay, Dr. Gay, of plagiarism. I'm just interested as an academic. Do you think she committed plagiarism?
I mean, there's no question that she committed plagiarism. There are some Harvard faculty members who are trying to redefine what is plagiarism. We all know what it is. And so she did violate that. And it was not just in her dissertation, it was also in some of her publications. And my beef with her is not really about, so there were two passages from my award-winning book, Black Faces, Black Interests, the Representation of African Americans in Congress, that she quoted without citations. When I examined her work on Monday, her publications, the one that led her to get tenure, what I noticed was not passages of my work, but her whole research agenda was building on the ideas from my award-winning book, because it was the seminal book at that time on representation, minority representation. It would have been expected normally that she would have acknowledged in a paragraph, or she would have it in the book cited in the bibliography.
Sure.
But the work was seminal. She was building on my work. And she got away with that. And I don't just blame her, I blame her committee members, because normally if it's a leading a piece of work, you have to engage it, either to refute it or to affirm it. By her not citing my work, that hurt me long term, because in academia, you are rewarded by the number of citations that you have. And so she did her publications. Her work was derivative of my work. In my opinion, her
Fascinating.
publications did not merit a tenure at an Ivy League school.
What I'm wondering about, and you were, I think it's fair to say, a trailblazer in Black women in education, especially in the political science world, in the way that you have been. I'm wondering if you think that Harvard protecting her in this way, this is a woman who clearly is a bigot based on her testimony, but you've laid out a case for why she is also someone who has violated another set of ethics that Harvard says they hold dear, which is academic integrity. I'm wondering if you think protecting her hurts the progress that has been made in the hard work of you and other Black women in academia. And I'm wondering if it does hurt that, why is this so sacred to Harvard, do you think?
But they're hurting their brand for DEI. And it doesn't just hurt Black people, it hurts every student at Harvard or even the ones who have graduated, because it devalues their degrees. And you can't say, oh, poor Claudine Gay, maybe she came from the inner city, a disadvantaged background. She went to the most elite boarding school in America, and that's where she got her K through 12 education. And so you can't say that she didn't know what plagiarism is. She has been, just promoted along, given awards for her writing. She won a prize for her senior thesis and also for the dissertation that was plagiarized. And so now she got caught. And instead of the university holding her to the same standards that a white man or white woman or a conservative Black male or female would be held to, they've decided to dig in deep. And I think that it's a tragedy for American education. It's a tragedy for Harvard. And it hurts everyone, not just Black people.
Now, mind you, Claudine Gay did end up resigning subsequently after that interview due to the mounting pressure. But it's worth noting how much defense Harvard put in on her behalf before that finally happened, in spite of the sheer incompetence that she displayed, not only because of her handling of the anti-Semitism, but also because of the breathtaking amount of plagiarism that she was involved in. To become the president of such a prestigious school and to use plagiarism that is that blatant to get there, either that shows how much of a fraudster she is, or it shows how far a school of the likes of Harvard has fallen, and whatever that may portend for all of the other schools, and more importantly, the kids in these schools who are making their way into the real world.
Let me just say this early, and everyone will come to it late. Plagiarism is the tip of the iceberg of attribution bullying, where effectively you have these people who determine who did what in the narrative-driven storytelling that is academic, and what papers get cited, which papers don't, what discoveries are named for certain people is determined largely by a tiny number of institutions, Harvard preeminent among them. And so Harvard just plays games morning, noon, and night with writing stories that put Harvard at the center and particular individuals at the top, whether or not those individuals have earned it or not. And what's hard for me is most people are now thinking, okay, Harvard is just full of it, but it isn't. It's half full of it and half the best place on earth to do anything important. And that tension is what's not recognized. Now, power has to take a back seat to academics and to discovery and to brilliance if this game is to be maintained. You can't constantly just exercise power and tell stories. So in my history with this university, I've tried to figure out, why does it behave so differently than every other institution of research?
Is DEI the boogeyman that everyone is worried about?
For those who might not be aware of what DEI is, DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And like many other similar ideas, it started out with a very reasonable goal. Goals such as trying to get rid of the discriminatory practices that made it impossible for people to not be able to make it into positions that they were qualified for. But it eventually morphed into a more insidious practice. I like the way Christian Watson from Prager University describes what DEI is today, and he describes it as applying unequal standards to ensure preferential outcomes for individuals and groups based on race, sex, and gender identity. It's almost exact opposite of what it was supposed to be. Specifically, it targets white heterosexual males who are put in last in any selection process regardless of their merit, instead of an opportunity-based approach where everybody has the same opportunity to go in, which is actually what we have now for the most part. We skip the opportunity part of the process and jump straight to the outcomes and try to manufacture that in the hopes that somehow that is going to create for a more fair and inclusive environment, when in fact it's doing the exact opposite.
Is DEI the boogeyman that everyone is worried about?
This is so hard to even get into it. Our universities won World War II in large measure. I mean, if you need codes broken, if you need new weapons developed, you're supposed to have SEAL Team 6 of the human mind that you can call on. And that's supposed to be MIT, Caltech, Princeton, Harvard. It's a very small number of super prestigious universities. Part of the problem is, if you think about, I don't know how to say this exactly. If you think about a university as akin to an exotic car, a lot of people buy a McLaren or a Lamborghini or Ferrari because they like the styling, status. But the soul of all of those cars is racing, right? And the people who buy the cars for the racing sometimes are really annoyed by the fact that the cars are status symbols. And that's what a research university is to me. I'm interested in the racing, and other people are interested because it's sort of what you do to show that you got a $2 million bonus from your investment banking job. If you don't race it, I don't know what you're doing there, and I prefer that you'd leave. The purpose of a university is not teaching. The purpose of a great university is training and research. And we can't afford to lose that. I don't think people have any idea how important it is to be able to call on your own nation's top academics when you need the truth, you need something done, you need help. And so whatever it is that is denaturing our universities, that's turning this into a nightclub where the whole trick is to get past the bouncer for the cool kids, has to be stopped.
You can tell Eric is very disheartened about his embattled alma mater. He seems like the guy who is trying to sound the alarm, trying to tell us not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and to recognize that there is something of value here that we should try to maintain, even while we rebuke the insidious practices that have continued to fester in such institutions.
But what does it say that the ex-president of Harvard is someone whose academic bona fides were found out to be plagiarized, largely?
I'm trying to say the balance between the sharp elbows and the sharp minds is wildly off. And why is it? Nobody wants to say what everybody is thinking, which is this person is not fit to be the president of Harvard University. And why is that? Because they're going to get called a name. This was made all about race. Oh, what, you can't tolerate scholarship of this quality from a black female? It's like, you're starting, I wasn't even questioning this before, but now you're saying a scholar's scholar, and he thinks that's too much. Look, we need to bring back exclusion. We're talking way too much about inclusion. Inclusion and exclusion are two halves of a normal process. Claudine Gay needed to be excluded from that office, not included. Now, if you told me that Condoleezza Rice was the president of Harvard, she's black, she's female, and I don't agree with her politically. But I don't think many people would have a qualification issue with Condoleezza Rice. Or let's say James Gates is a black man, a distinguished physicist. This has to do with people coming from weaker subjects, particularly activist subjects that didn't exist before the late 60s, early 70s, when all of these things were created. You know, to an extent, when you had, I don't know if you recall the pictures of, Willard Straight Hall at Cornell with the black students emerging with weapons. You know, there was a revolutionary fervor at the end of the 60s, early 70s, and you have people creating like women's studies, black studies, African-American studies. And these departments were basically born of activism more than scholarship. I'm not saying no scholarship gets done there, but scholarship and activism are essentially fused. And many of us think activism is great, just don't do it next to our physics and math and computer science and music departments. You know, if what you're really there to do is to ignore certain things and accentuate others and not search for the truth, that's not an ignoble pursuit. It's just, that's not what scholarship is. Scholarship is about understanding things and getting them right. And we've gone down a terrible turn. But, you know, just consider it cooks things up. It cooks up stories. It cooks up attribution. It gives people credit for things that they didn't do first. It takes credit away from other people. The point being that the Harvard jobs market meeting inside of the Harvard economics department is a star chamber the way the immigration status of Obama's father was a star chamber, as was the way in which my PhD was. Over and over again, Harvard closes its doors and it makes stuff up.
This sounds unsalvageable. As
No.
somebody, it sounds like we've got the people leading it have gotten in through some combination of diversity, equity, inclusion, nepotism, game playing, harsh elbows.
There's no shortage of absolutely fantastic people at Harvard.
But if they're unable or unwilling to play the political games that are required, unless they're prepared to file their elbows down to a sharp point.
Well, this is what Bill Ackman is doing that's so confusing. I have the feeling, I don't know this guy at all. Don't have positive, negative
I thought you
feelings.
would have crossed paths with him at some point.
You would think. There are various people who I don't cross paths with for whatever reason. I don't even think we follow each other. Or maybe I follow him, but I don't think he follows me. I think that the problem is that a lot of these people don't know how the research game works. They think about this in terms of the Harvard Business School, the law school, the undergraduate alumni network. They don't see the part of Harvard that actually produces the mystique. the analog of the racing for the exotic car. And I worry that the right thing to do right now is to appoint a curmudgeonly, research-oriented person in a super rigorous field. It doesn't even have to be STEM. Like music is an incredibly rigorous field. But what we need right now is rigor. We don't need another person from the social sciences at this moment. We need somebody to reestablish that Harvard is an intolerant place, that it has the highest possible standards. It's unabashedly elitist. It's unabashedly American. And it cannot live with DEI. DEI is a parasitization of our best hopes and dreams. And we have to recognize that DEI has to be destroyed so that goals like diversity and getting the right people into the room are not sacrificed on the altar of mediocrity and lack of ethics. Already, Yale has mismanaged its research university for years. It made a very bad decision not to go hard on sciences and STEM and focused, in my opinion, too much on softer fields. So what happens when Harvard is no longer that prestigious? If people start laughing at Harvard, what good is it going to be that you can get your kid in?
I don't disagree, but I think people are so out of touch. The people who are in power are unable or unwilling to see just how quickly the stock price is plummeting. I don't think that they're able to see this. Thinking about it, especially using the Marvel example again, or some of the things that are coming out of Disney, you have a quantifiable figure. What was the opening weekend at the box office? You know exactly where this is. There are fewer places to hide when it comes to that. Here's the number. What did it cost? What did you make opening weekend?
Right.
And you have projections and you have targets, presumably, that you want to hit. If that number doesn't cause people to think, maybe we don't need another narrative about an all-female cast that is better than the men without overcoming any challenges.
What you're not looking at is, if you look at Mike Hopkins' work on the Curvarian variant in the mathematics department, that's like opening weekend statistics. Man, great stuff happens at Harvard. Make no mistake about it. Harvard is an amazing and horrible place. And we're going to all now focus on how dumb it is and how horrible it is. Yeah. And then you're not seeing the tragedy. You're not seeing, look, I didn't have an advisor. I was one of the only people you'll ever meet with a PhD that had no advisor. But the guy who saved me was named Raoul Bott. And Raoul Bott discovered something that's so important called Bott periodicity that if I could convey it to you, your mind would be, you'd think DMT was for children. It has to do with the fact that there are only 4 systems of numbers that have particular property, and one of those sets of numbers spins a merry-go-round with the other 3 with an 8-fold sort of symmetry. Who knew that this thing was even possible? It's an incredible fact about the world. I associate him with Harvard. That's unfudgeable. There's no one in the world who can tell me that Bott periodicity wasn't one of the most important things that happened in the 20th century. And to have a person like that, just feet from John Tate, I could go on and on about all the real things that happened at Harvard. What we need right now, you need somebody who has not been on this kind of escalator to power, who's constantly shown love by the system. There are all sorts of people that represent what I call black sheep Harvard. You've got white sheep Harvard and black sheep Harvard. And black sheep Harvard is no less important, but it's the people who are not loved by the system, who don't know when to shut up. The people who will take a stand and who will zig when everyone else zags.
Why would that be useful?
Because we've got to purge the university of the things that don't work, and it's going to be ugly. It's going to be unpleasant. It's going to be a civil war on the faculty. Most of the way these things work is that you're afraid to speak. Let's predict what's going to be said when this debuts. Sour grapes, grifter, charlatan, Eric doesn't like women, Eric doesn't like black people. Oh, such snobbery. What has he ever done? We know what every action brings about in terms of its response. And that's kind of why we don't speak up. It's just not worth it. There are these horrible people that follow you around looking for you to say anything like, I don't know if she's qualified. It's like, did he say it? Can we get our knives out? That thing has to be driven out of the university. We can't have these people.
It's not just in the university though, right?
No, but I'm saying the universities are special because if everyone is going to take power later passes through them, you can't afford to lose them. You can't afford to lose your news media. You can't afford to lose your universities. You can't afford to lose your political parties.
Yeah. 3 for 3 at the moment.
That's right. Yeah. But look, is worth fighting for. So, they'll call me a bunch of names. They'll try to deface my Wikipedia entry. That's what they'll do.
Speaking out, standing our ground in the face of people who do not want us to have an opinion, let alone a voice. That is what I hear echoed over and over again by so many people, the likes of Eric Weinstein, John McWhorter, Sam Harris, and I think there must be something to it, as difficult as that might be. I think we all need to exercise some courage when it comes to creating an environment that allows for civil discord, no matter what opinions are being laid on the table. And we have to demand that other people give us a voice, just as we demand that they should get a voice, regardless of what their opinions may be. Barring violence, this is the only way forward for a society with the unprecedented level of multiculturalism that we find ourselves in, to be able to interact with any semblance of cohesion without drifting into civil war.